talk about Steve DiBenedetto, and it's Steve's first time at the Studio Center, and he's come to share more about his work, his love of thick paint, distressed surfaces, his process of manipulation and abstraction, and even his musical talent. That was him on the drums and the sort of background music as you came in. But to share a little bit more about Steve's background, his recent exhibitions include the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, Derek Eller Gallery, and David Nolan Gallery in New York, Daniel Weinberg Gallery in LA, the Whitney, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as a two-person exhibition with Terry Winters at the National Exemplar in New York. And currently, he has a show at the Half Gallery in New York, where his show titled Pre-Linguistic Granola just opened on Tuesday, and that runs until May 14th. Steve has been the recipient of numerous awards, including a Tiffany Foundation Award, the Rosenthal Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as a residency at the Claude Monet Foundation in Giverny. His work is included in the public collections of the American Academy, the Morgan Library, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, MoMA, as well as the Whitney. And I'm going to let Steve share the rest. And everyone, please join me in welcoming Steve DiBenedetto.
Thanks. Wow. Well, good to be here. Oh, you're going to hit the leg. Yeah, this. Whoa. Boy, it sure gets dark in here. I can't see anything. Anyway, good to see you guys. Well, seeing you guys. Yeah, this musical thing, I wanted to try that because I just did as was mentioned, a show at the Aldrich Museum, which just came down, and having had this musical habit, let's say, for years, decades, I finally got around to incorporating something about drumming and composition into this installation. So I wanted to try and integrate this into a situation like art was. So thanks for putting up with all this cacophony or whatever it is. But it was something I was actually pretty happy about. It was a nice thing to add. I've never been 100% comfortable with the music-art combo in my sort of, art life, but I'm increasingly a little more, okay with that because people just keep bringing it up. So, but it does come up in this slide talk. For example, one of the things I wanted to start with was a little test of sorts that I did in my head. You can put the first slide up there. Yeah, not one of my paintings, clearly, and and weird color, but that's the way computers are. But anyway, I like to start with this notion that years ago, I think preparing for one of these types of things, I was thinking, what if I had to be sort of completely honest with myself, in some sort of very authentic way, what would I consider two fundamental strains that I could say my work, threads that are running through the work? And one would be Cezanne, for sure. I mean, I just felt like Cezanne is somehow this, undeniable thing for me. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about earlier today was, and for recent days is, I like thinking about Cezanne, for example, as the guy who, if you think about the work that came before him, like David and these grandiose French historical paintings, how these impressionists, I mean, obviously he wasn't the first, but there's something kind of cool about those guys beating those glamorous, gigantic, epic historical paintings with these grungy, strange, almost like, I think of them as almost garage rock band paintings, small and crusty, and I think a lot of people had a hard time with them. But it's also the way Cezanne's always negotiating two completely conflicting things, what he's seeing, what's on the canvas, this kind of energy. I mean, there's really basically friction in Cezanne. But less than the exact aesthetic of him and me. It's more just, I don't know, you could pick any number of artists, but I figured, well, for me it would be Cezanne and Led Zeppelin. This would have to be, I would be very happy if people ultimately saw my whole output and said, oh, of course, it's a combination of Cezanne and Led Zeppelin. I mean, and the reason, and once again, it doesn't have to be Led Zeppelin 2 per se, it doesn't have to be Led Zeppelin, but this is, in terms of excavating your own sort of mental history and evolution, whatever you want to call it, psychologically or culturally, even more importantly. This is like a good example of like when you're a certain age, and this was the first band and or record that I guess I felt I was, encountered the idea of mythologizing something. It was like just presented to me through certain, family, sort of slightly older relatives. And as much as it's not so much about the thematic qualities, it's just about the idea of, and I guess, once again, I hope this runs through the work of mine, but I feel like ultimately I'm constantly wrestling with various conflicting polarities, and one of the operative concerns and or like, neuroses or like preoccupations and irritable things that irritate me are, like if you have all these different things you want to make and you like, it seems like history tends to suggest that you're supposed to resolve them in some weird way, or that you're supposed to pick. And I've always, I don't know, I feel like I've, over the course of making all this stuff, wanted to resist that and just somehow keep the idea of I don't know what I want to paint as the sort of the operative sort of force in the work, in spite of the fact that sometimes things do get painted, they actually do. But going back into like olden times, like here's like a painting from 1986, that I felt like, I sort of, it's not that big, like a modest scale thing, using spray paint as a way of being a little bit, avoiding traditional art materials. I mean, this was a little bit right after school, and feeling like, you want to work in a way that's connected to the world. Like I sort of inherited a historical mentality of, where things had to be furthered. You had to like be extreme, and I was always drawn to more extreme kinds of art and extreme kinds of music. To me, this painting, I remember, I don't have any images of, but like, I don't know if you guys know Blinky Palermo's, some of his later works, which are like film strip things. And so to me, this was a little bit about trying to articulate something about blankness, like emptiness or information. It was a little Neo Geo times in those days too. So it was, to me, this painting started a certain concern for how a certain sort of industrial or technological or, basically a graphic, more, not so much geometric art, but more like graph calibration, I think, is something that interested me. That painting was titled after this record, these are some records that, I put up some record album covers that were kind of symptomatic of some of the ideas and energies that I was feeling, me and friends of mine in the 80s were drawn to. This title, The Process of Weeding Out, I really liked. As a reference to the idea of searching and trying to decipher, trying to get down to something essential, something in some weird way. But it's like, I feel like a lot of the music stuff that I was drawn to, obviously Ornette Coleman and other things, was not so much about the exact graphics of these covers, but the attitude in the music. I mean, Jimmy Smith's own thing, that's obviously a great cover, I can't deny that. I mean, it's not so much a nutty musical experience. But, there's something about keeping that, I guess, from rock and roll or from a type of cultural energy that keeps the art lineage somehow, honest or balanced or corrupted. That's been the thing that I've always been preoccupied with. This is a painting from '87, Thrasher. It was also done with spray paint, and a lot of these 80s paintings of mine, like they had a sort of a more formal, let's say, kind of organization. But the idea was, how can a kind of so-called formalist abstraction relate to the increased amount of two-dimensionality now it's in the world rampant, but even in those days, for me, it was like responding to bank machines and just screens emerging, two-dimensionality permeating the so-called real world, which apparently we're not in up here, from what I've heard, which I'm happy to hear that. The real world is wildly overrated. But, so these early paintings were about something to do with information and the vibrations of technology and some sense of that. That's a tiny little painting, 8x10, that I like to, of course, get to point out that this painting, or one just like it, was reproduced in High Times magazine, which I'm very proud of, actually. Some kind of review was written. And not as a 100% devoted pot smoking person. I snuck in there, but not opposed to it. Anyway, that was sort of a nice moment. And so these were, once again, being done with industrial sort of materials. And this is like a 30-inch square where the optics, I guess, even though I don't really like the idea of op art coming into the picture, but this was like, I mean, to be honest, like I look at these sequence of these sort of paintings, and I'm remembering how, a lot of times you make stuff and you just get caught up in a particular methodology, and it's like, well, where can that go, and what can that be about, and what can that yield? And, it's not so much, I mean, the content factor for me, once again, is about something to do with cyber. I was thinking in those days a lot about cyberpunk, as it were, atmospheres in society where technology and counterculture are meeting, and there's a dystopic, notion which I'm completely, on the side of. This one is symptomatic of, you can sense, like, these were made with skinny things of tape, of course, and like the sort of fragmented stuff in the middle was the bleeding, that occurred accidentally, but I found that to be sort of analogous to the idea of a virus or whatever, the idea of a viral, once again, a contaminant, a dysfunction, a kind of breakdown going on. When that ultimately became something I wanted to explore and, take further in one form or another. At this juncture, I mean, in these days, this is a friend of mine who actually died, Stephen Perino. He died in a motorcycle crash in 2005, but we were good friends in school, and bringing Stephen up is symptomatic of how I got opportunities to show. I mean, on the kind of anecdotal career side, sort of jabber. Like Stephen was a guy that right after school just knew everyone, just seemed to know like everybody in the East Village, and he called me up one day and said, "Oh, you're going to get a call from this woman who wants to go look at your work." I'm like, "Oh, great, who's that?" And there's this woman, Clarissa Dalrymple, who of course I had no idea at the time was running the totally hottest, coolest gallery ever, Cable Gallery, which a lot of really great artists came out of. So instead of waiting for her to call, I just went down and said, I hear you're looking for me, which I don't know if you're supposed to do that, but she was like, "Oh, yes, we want to come over and see what you're doing," which was great. And I got the opportunity to show various things with Clarissa and Cable, and they closed, of course, a few years after that. But it was, I had an interesting dynamic with Stephen, and he's of course been like, the guy dies and couldn't sell a thing, really, barely, and just it's hard to believe still in this day that he dies and boom, $800,000, like instantly these things are going for. So it's kind of we all get a little warped out by that. Like it's kind of good, but it's kind of a drag, like what are you going to do? So he was part of my history early on, and we went our various ways, but. Important fellow, and really brilliant with musical awareness, and turned me on to lots of good. But once again, in his paintings, you can see an attitude of something less than content with the status of painting, and I think that's the thing I'm feeling really driven by myself. So here's a thing I started doing relating to the idea of a sort of, a toxicity, let's say, that started to maybe ooze through these more logical or more geometric or more, kind of like files, like, graphs and things like that. Richter-esque, admittedly, but the idea was to sort of, once again, explore the possibilities of how painting can be mutated and screwed around with. This is a pretty large one from the early 90s, like 8 feet or so, and they were pretty fun to make. They were fun to like make. This is all this aluminum paint and spray paint, and probably the whole thing's falling apart by now. I have no idea, but that's what you have to do. But there was like fluorescent paint, and this, once again, this interest in the idea of, the idea of industrial materials turned into something science fictional or something problematic out there, by and large. So that was kind of a fun. And this is work by another fellow named Banks Violet, who was a student of mine, who I bring up mainly because the history thing, like with Stephen, like he had a particular Banks as an artist really involved with notions of, sort of black metal, musical stuff, like Norwegian black metal and all of these like notions about evil and things like that, and sort of did pretty well for himself for a while and was kind of coming back into the picture. But it was interesting because Banks had a certain reverence for Perino, my old friend, who I had different views on. But Banks, from his whole he's a younger guy, and his whole generational view of Perino was completely different than mine. And it got me thinking about how, information is passed on. And I got to be a certain age, around 10-something years ago, 12 years ago. I got to be this age where Banks is telling me things about an artist I knew, and he saw his whole output differently. And it's a little bit like, Tony Shafrazi, you may have heard of. These are my kind of cheeky photos of him getting arrested after he defaced Guernica, famously in the 70s, which I weirdly don't condemn him for that, maybe, because a lot of that stuff was in the air. Anyway, the point is that Tony I showed with, he had a pretty major gallery for a while, and he used to correct us about Robert Smithson, who we worshipped, of course. So it was kind of like, I was being told things by Tony that had to do with Robert Smithson that were not unlike me telling Banks things about Perino. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, I don't know. I just figured that was just one of those evolutionary things that happen in your art sort of trajectory that I reflect on and find kind of curious. So by now, these are paintings I was showing with Shafrazi in like the early 90s, 4 by 5 foot. I made tons of these. They were just like, complete, improvisational, just let things happen, have no overt concern for compositional clarity. It's sort of like the whole, what would you call it, sort of formal apparatus is decaying. They're obviously influenced by aspects of certain German painting that was going on at the time, which I'm actually quite fond of. Polka, clearly, and some other people. But I think what's cool about seeing these for me too is that as sort of mucky and as paintings of mine, as they evolve, there's a certain kind of tendency for them to get clotted, some would say. I don't necessarily see it that way, but it's and yet I feel like there's still a pop art element in my work. And I used to have this analogy in my head of like toys like on the beach, like bright colored things melting, like oozing into the sand or something like that. Everybody knows I think everyone knows the discomfort of beach culture. I know I can't stand it, when it's plastic. I love beaches, but if they're empty, completely empty. But the idea of melting plastic and sand and blah, blah, blah. So that used to be a weird kind of analogy I still would like to think is still kind of operative in the work, even though, as you'll see, different kinds of content started to permeate things. So, how do you reconcile like pop syntheticness and a weird way of like wanting to be a painter? Like I always 100% believe in painting. Like I don't believe in it. I shouldn't say that. I believe in making the most out of the restraint of painting. Put it that way. Same thing with drum set. I totally do not like percussion or all the things people hit. That's great, but that's not. I just like the idea of the drum set. Like, it's ideological on some level. With painting, it's more common. It's just like, how do you max out a painting? What can we do? Like, I really don't care about painting one thing or the other, frankly. But I don't also believe in just random throw darts at a board sort of approach, which kind of got me thinking about my next whole group. One of the things I had to do at this time, mid-90s or so, early 90s, was out of that kind of like chaotic spew of things I was doing, an architectural component emerged, and this was, I figured I had to hang on to something because those paintings were very liberating, but they were driving me crazy. They weren't adding up to anything. I felt like everybody was doing that kind of thing. So this was a painting, about an 8-foot high thing that it came from a Xerox I had in my studio, which frankly, an old engraving of the Louvre, which I didn't really know it was the Louvre at the time, but I projected it more or less, roughly, and just started filling it in a kind of color by number, I guess I would call, I called it kind of way, but a messed up color by number approach, where things are bleeding and it's coming in and out of focus, and a lot of this sort of Baroque architecture. That's like a 10-foot high painting, and for the sake of technical discussion, the bright blue, the way these were made was to draw out this image more or less with black acrylic, then put down this phthalo blue acrylic wash, really synthetic blue color, and then fill in with oil paint. All the brighter stuff is oil. So the blue is sort of, it's kind of seeping through like some kind of video light. It really is, it's kind of a weird, sometimes like a pretty weird effect. Nothing genius about it. It's pretty basic, but it had a kind of a distinctive quality. You see it in this one too. This idea of like color by number laid over something. So these are like excursions into trying to land somewhere and be somewhere specific, at least for the time being. Because as usual, I had to just start screwing around, and the idea of getting kind of exploratory started to emerge. But ultimately, shut off your cell phones, please. Vibrate. So at this point, mid-90s or so, Shafrazi had enough of me. It wasn't adding up. And I had I was looking through, things to grasp onto, and a lot of literary, or not so much literature and written things were accumulating in my studio, some of which were references to Close Encounters, and I had, been for a long time, since like 88 or so, 87, been reading various things about paranormal sorts of psychedelic culture, UFO-related things, and these were things that were, of fundamental interest to me and other people I knew, but not things I had no idea how to actually operate with in the studio. But eventually, I used this Close Encounters. This was like turmoil-y time in a way, and to me, the Close Encounters mountain. Obviously, you guys know the movie. The dude, Richard Dreyfuss is kind of driven by some compulsion, and not exactly unlike an artist, of course, to make this form. He doesn't know what the hell where it's coming from. And so these things were, Tony actually was encouraging me to you gotta relate to media, relate to the world. So this stuff accumulated. And I started at the end of the day, if I really want to put my chips on something, what do I, if I had to be really honest once again, and however embarrassing it is, I ultimately looked around and thought, if I really had to spend my time reading or thinking about anything, it would be this weird psychedelic, paranormal, multi-dimensional ideas about space and consciousness. And these magazines I had accumulated, this weird this magazine Revisions, which significantly had a interview with Terence McKenna. I don't know if any of you guys know Terence McKenna, who is kind of a dude who completely reconsidered the lineage of psychedelic history. When we encountered McKenna, he died, I guess, in 2000 or so, but he had a vantage point that seemed like he was contextualizing the whole psychotropic, ethnobotanical, anthropological dimension in a much bigger scope than, say, what we thought of Timothy Leary with, say, his 60s. Leary's bigger than that, but he kind of screwed it up, really. But McKenna was it's fascinating to read. The guy, and for me, and with a lot of this UFO business and, a lot of the things that came out of these magazines, I remember thinking, I still think it, but I remember initially thinking, okay, a lot of this stuff might be completely crazy, and I believe the official term is crackpot. But let's say, what can we say about it? Let's pretend, let's not just do the usual predictive thing of dismiss it all as nutty. What if? What if some of these notions are true? I have to point out, though, I do not believe, what I always said and say is UFOs are not real. They're real because we have a word for them. I think the whole idea of stuff landing, that's totally irrelevant. Whether or not Roswell, all that is a kind of a smokescreen. The really important thing is why we are even concerned about elsewhere, on that scale. And the fact that we have a term, UFO, means it's integrated into our consciousness on some level. So approaching the psychedelic stuff, approaching the sort of extraterrestrial thing, and McKenna would say the same thing. Like, he approached all his investigations into psilocybin and its history from a totally skeptic point of view. Like, well, prove to me. Like, I'll take you seriously. Like the mushroom he's talking about. I'll take you seriously, and I've heard if you do those things, you'll see stuff, and you'll have a dialogue with the mushroom. And McKenna took it to a certain level, and he, did an amazingly interesting body of work. I mean, some of his notions that I guess have stuck with me are, among many, the idea that maybe on a proto-human level, pre-linguistic, for example, humanoid, pre-conscious humanoid, taking psychoactive plant substances way back may have contributed to the evolution of consciousness as we know it. And as I always like to point out too, like whether these ideas are right or not is kind of irrelevant. They're interesting, and for artist needs, interesting is good enough. You don't have to be right as an artist. You have to be interesting. So my feeling was to try to embrace this and see what one can do with it, and take it somewhere. This was a really crucial article that I ran across in this magazine back then, way back when, and it introduced me to Arthur M. Young, who invented the Bell 47 helicopter, very famous, bubble-headed helicopter. In this article, this guy, Dennis Stillings, basically throws out that he was researching UFOs in whatever, God knows what way he was doing it, I guess quasi-scientifically. But he encountered the idea that Arthur Young's helicopter, the Bell 47, which was the first commercially licensed helicopter in 46 or so, coincided with the whole advent of the modern UFO era, as it's called sometimes. So he stumbled onto that sort of nexus of activity and started to then research Arthur Young. It turns out that Arthur Young had hugely complex thoughts about consciousness, spiritualism, ideas about other dimensions. He came out of Princeton in the 20s, 1927, as a mathematician, math major. Got obsessed with rotary physics, rotary activity mechanics. Decided to go to Bell Labs to develop the aspects of the helicopter. Spent like 10 years or so there. But evolved all these wild ideas about the nature of, the universe, consciousness, developed this whole notion of the so-called theory of process. I think ultimately with Young, you've got a guy who's trying to be even more inclusive than Einstein with the unified field notion, trying to include the sort of intangible, the more spiritual, the idea, aspects of consciousness. Where does that come from? How can that be fused with a model of a more mechanical nature? So I love Young. I mean, he's like this, super nuts and bolts guy who also entertains really kind of outlandish-ish notions about things, but he's dead serious about it. And frankly, he seems like exactly what the artist is supposed to do. At the end of the day, we're sort of faced with that. So that, that sort of, in a state of various, freaked outness, I figured, well, let me just see what I can do with this material. This, of course, is a great quote of McKenna's that stimulated my preoccupation with the octopus, which shows up in a lot of work after this point. And his notions about the octopus as an animal that it's the magnitude of its, what do I call it, the sort of morphological dynamism of the octopus, color changing, shape changing, mutability, is, as he says here, a kind of communication. And I just read, a friend of mine I get stuff sent to me about octopuses all the time. And I'm not a naturalist. I hate to say, I don't really care about the octopus per se myself. Like, I'm not into meeting them or swimming necessarily. But it's, I'm not opposed to it. It's just, this is enough. I use the octopus to connect to McKenna's image of the octopus as a creature that might be a model for a future form of communication, hence a visual one. As he points out, the idea that the octopus the octopus shows its thoughts, its feelings. Like its skin, its complexion, it's a type of communication. And he likens it to what would it be like for us to evolve to that level as an equal jump to what it must have been like for pre-linguistic humanoids in relationship to language, as I'm using it now, rather poorly, of course. And it'd be so much easier if I could just show you what I'm trying to say, which is kind of why we make stuff. But I just read a great article that somebody sent me. I think it's a recently written article about an octopus, and it was this, you guys probably aware of Inky. This isn't the article, this is another. Inky in New Zealand escaped from his aquarium and went down a 168-foot tube right into the ocean. Inky, that's his name, the octopus in New Zealand, yes. He escaped basically back home out of this elaborate slither. I mean, they do this, octopuses. But anyway, the one I was going to refer to is another article where this guy mentions that in investigating the octopus, it appears, it's possible to suggest that it actually sees with its skin. Like analyzing the brain neurology of the octopus and its optics, it only really has one major eye. And that, I read this just actually on the way up here, frankly. And the idea that the octopus can see with its skin is like, I don't even care if that's true. I just like the idea of that. It's awesome. I mean, and it proves, in a sense, it doesn't exactly prove, but it reinforces the idea that, oh shit, maybe there's something to this, Like, why not, Anyway, this is another magazine that was in the flow of things. Reality Hackers, that's Sun Ra, of course. Hard to argue with him. And this, once again, the 90s for me was symptomatic of the way technology, human evolution, notions of the future, archaicism, is that a word? I don't know, old stuff, are all getting woven and trying to be made sense of. And that's kind of what I felt close to. So like paintings like this from like early 2000, well actually as was mentioned, I had this awesome opportunity to go to Giverny, where Monet painted his paintings and all, and in 1999, I swear, I mean, you guys should do this more, because I just invited this woman over out of the blue, who I kind of knew, this woman Yvonne Force, who I was desperate to have somebody look at what I was working on, and I invited her over, and she comes over in May of 1999, and says, "Oh, Steve, that was great, I love what you're doing, but what are you doing this summer?" I'm like, "I don't know, sweating, toiling, miserable, She's like, "Well, how would you like to go to Giverny for 2-3 months and give you some money, a bunch of money, and you could work there?" I'm like, all right. It was like, yeah, I think that might work. Absolutely bizarre, like totally unexpected thing. Now, of course, Monet is fantastic. I mean, he's awesome. He's not exactly, who cares though? Monet is irrelevant. The place was fantastic. And so, sure enough, I went, and so it was a really productive 3 months, I guess it was, of working on like 40, like this is a little painting I did over there. This one, I did, I don't know, I'm not saying I finished 40 paintings, but I did like 40 canvases. So I was able to have a show with these, and it was actually a really like boostful moment, 2000, 2002, 2003. Like I did a show of small paintings. This one's later, it's not from that ilk. This is typical of that. Anyway, it was a really like rejuvenated sort of moment, and got, like people were, on board, and it led to interesting things. Well, here's Arthur Young, for going back to his significance, looking at himself and testing the helicopter out. Here's the classic Bell 47. Here's his famous book he wrote when he was at Bell Labs, this sort of diary, where he conjures up at this, somewhere in the middle of this, and he's going crazy working at Bell Labs. He brings up the Psychopter. What he said was, I'm trying to make a helicopter. I'm working on the helicopter, but what I'm really working towards is what he called the Psychopter, which is this fantastical notion of a vehicle that would transport the self, as he called the winged self. So he's thinking in these very mythological, mythic terms, as he's like, failing, succeeding. It's like, I don't know, it seems like an amazing consciousness to me. Here's another book of his, The Geometry of Meaning, another excursion later on. Here's a charcoal drawing I did somewhere in there, 2000s, late 90s, trying to fuse all these concerns, all right? Just like charcoal. And, I guess latching onto the octopus was a really good, there's a point where you guys, you know how it is. You have to at some point say, fuck it. I don't know if I can justify all this, but I can't get it out of my head. Therefore, I will, put my chips on it and see what combinations of these things can, well, that's, of course, a classic shot. I put a little book together a few years ago of various images with a half gallery 2 years ago, and I remember La Dolce Vita famously, has this image of helicopter dragging Christ, the statue of Christ. This is an outtake, I think. It's not in the movie. But sure enough, in the film, it is a Bell 47, which I was very happy about, because there's a very distinct difference between different helicopters. Let's not kid ourselves, It's not all, they're not all the same. So it seemed like the logical helicopter. So these are, that was a little one I did in Giverny. So, a lot of these paintings are just about, at this stage in the game, just exploring these components that I decided to embrace, and I guess it's like casting on some level. This is a 4x5 foot painting that is kind of significant, I think, because God, it's a weird color, but the octopus in this is super encrusted the way it's painted. It's like expressionistic-y in some odd way, and the helicopters are pretty transparent. But more than that, it's somehow it evolved to have this kind of political-ish content, like Iraqi thing going on, which I have to say I don't really think about implanting those notions in the work. However, I think it's kind of useful for me to sometimes have aspects of the painting that are grounded in some weird way, even if the ground they're on is volatile and shaky and war-torn, and can't seem to get away from that. So these are some things I did in the early 2000s. This one I was always really fond of. Just some kind of hieroglyphic thing going on in this one that I really... These are not planned out, I should point out. These are here's a painting that I think turned out pretty good, but was in a state of disaster for so many months. I mean, just the worst piece of crap, just laying in the corner, complete, hopelessness. And I have found, and once again, I don't know about anyone else here, but I have found that sometimes the paintings that are least likely to add up, like the kid in high school, least likely to succeed or something, end up whoa, they end up doing something. I mean, whether they're great or not, but at least they get their shit together at some point and they function. So this was you can see in some of these remnants of a preoccupation with amusement parks. This was an exaggeration of a Ferris wheel kind of spinning maybe quite a bit too fast, and a helicopter, and then its shadow, but I like the idea of that relationship, maybe going through some sort of porthole of some kind or another. This one starts my preoccupation with architecture that I'll get to in a little while. This one I always was really fond of. These are some colored pen. I was always doing a lot of drawing as concurrently, and as similar. I mean, you can see there are similarities regarding the content of the imagery, but no drawing relates to any painting specifically. I think these are with the music thing. They're all independent activities, independent paths. I feel. This one I called Octopus, just in a very cheesy way, admittedly, because the octopus is black and white, like Wizard of Oz. It's partly in color, partly in black and white. So I kind of like that combination. These are another group that were started, or David Nolan, the first show I had with him in 2005. Helicopter, I guess, crashing, but essentially maybe transforming, that I liked. This is a group, these are long, this is 10 feet by 6, and it's kind of started a series of, I don't know what to call it, sort of epic-ish things I started doing. It seems like once again, like the whole dynamic in the studio or the output activity is experiment, fool around, don't plan, and then say, all right, enough of this. How can I just do a definitive example of one of these damn things, you know? Just like try and make a definitive, specific, get all the characters together and, you know, sort of define it. I think that's a good motivational thing to have. These are all really, you know, like I said, like 9, 10 feet at least across. So it's kind of like a attempt at just dumping this stuff out. This painting was 2006. It was in the show at the Whitney. That was kind of a great show to be in, I have to say. It was 8 artists in the Carol Dunham, Julie Merito, me, and Alex Ross, Franz Ackerman, Terry Winters, Ati Meyer, and I'm forgetting, Matthew Ritchie. And it was great. It was like superstars, and man, I couldn't be happier. You have your own room, but, you know, it was kind of a flop, frankly. Somehow it just didn't add up. I don't know what happened there. It was like so much information. I loved it, of course. I thought it was great. But it was a weird show. It was like, I don't think they were ready, people were really ready for the amount of visual stimulus. I mean, in my own case, it's always been an issue. Like, every time I'm told, oh, you know, you should really leave some room, breathing room. And it's like, no. More stuff will get jammed in there. You know, it's like adolescent defiance, admittedly. But, you know, I think this painting has its merits. And this is another one of these, like, let's just try and do a helicopter painting and get it over with. This is the one drawing, a little ink drawing that I did that I'm showing mainly because it probably was the one time a drawing stimulated a painting, which is this painting, which was in a, you know, helicopter kind of pulling down, an octopus pulling down the helicopter. Some weird impulse to want to destroy these things, maybe, like get them out of here, figure out what their relationship is. It just keeps going and going. This was, all right, now here's like a whole other dimension I got obsessed with, or preoccupied with architecture, modern architecture. This is this is a gouache thing on a plasticky paper, Yupo, you guys probably know it. Just once again, trying to play with the idea of the increasingly like ubiquitous glass building everywhere. I'm still trying to figure out my feelings about all this, the landscape we're in. And I got, you know, once again, I think the architecture thing for me became a kind of antidote, let's say, like stuff I'm seeing and around and trying to just figure out my feelings about it. Something really started to irritate me years ago about aspects of the scale of recent architecture. So I got it in my head. Now, you guys, I don't know, I'm sure, I haven't really thought this 100% through, but I got it in my head that so many new buildings, so much celebrated architecture, some of it's perfectly good, wants to be sculpture. Like I feel like there's this huge confusion about like when, and I made it my own little like, what do you call it, sort of exercise, to try and think in my head, when did buildings stop looking like buildings and start looking like sculpture, like giant big sculptures? And of course, I guess Frank Gehry, I made this. This is a tin foil, you know, clump pretty much on the kitchen. And I mean, it's like you could basically blow that up and you'd have, and if you mix that with that, Clement Meadmore, famous sculptor from the 70s, I call it animated minimalism, his category. I made that up. Clement Meadmore twisted. You pretty much get buildings like that. I mean, you basically confuse the scale. And my problem with this sort of thing is not the aesthetics of it per se, but it's the scale. Like, it just looks like a blown up little thing. And I think these, you know, kinds of buildings are, and I'm sort of analyzing this as much as I admittedly am trying to mount a criticism of it. I feel like these buildings are just made on completely arbitrary terms, not in relationship to actual buildedness, like say the Guggenheim, Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, which is a spiral, which is a kind of a built thing, like a shell, you know, and you can walk on the ramp. It's a big old ramp, you know, and you walk, and it's sculptural, the building, but it's not trying to be a sculpture. You don't look at the Guggenheim and say, oh, it was once this big, and they just blew it up, which, of course, it was that big at one time as a model, I assume. But anyway, it doesn't look that way, and I think a lot of these new things have that quality, Like, so I got it in my head. This, of course, is the Crystal Cathedral in Anaheim, which I am sort of fond of, I have to say. I like the idea that it fuses New Age imagery, like crystals, with, Christianity. I don't know what that exact connection is, but I think it's a curious notion. So I got it in my head to try to make some studies a while back of buildings that, like this, once again, it's the wash thing, and it doesn't look like what I wanted it to be, but my whole feeling is, why can't buildings be more ambitious, more confused, less conformist, more eccentric, more unique, blah, blah. There's money, these things cost tons of money anyway. So like imagine a building where half of it is this very sheer, perfect, modern, crystalline facade. The other half is like Angkor Wat or something, like some encrusted Cambodian jungle thing, So you're somehow saying something about the contrast of modernism, and going back to like ancient connections, and not so much ancient, but historic ones where scale played a role. So these are sketches and things I did. A building that might be half quarry, looked like the quarry as opposed to the, just the crystalline thing. And here's a painting that emerged around then that it's kind of like an oil paint, a big, 5-6 feet of a goofy sort of fake, parody. I'd like to think of those as parodistic. I mean, some of these, I'm pretty sure that's Louis Kahn. I can't remember, maybe not. But the idea of the scale and the scale of, say, a Gaudi building, which is a great example of what I like, not that I like, but it makes sense, that it's sand castle. And the sand castle, it's not a blown up version. It's built like the way things get built. And I think that's an important thing. This is, of course, Adolf Loos and Bruno Taut. Really, of course, brilliant, very oppositional in many ways, those guys. But interesting forms. And a great architect, I think, from Chicago, Jenny Gang, who is a newish building. It's, fantastic. I mean, it has some relationship to where it's coming from, hence Chicago. Windy, worn. It's got this identity that's not just about, as Paul Goldberger said about it, it's got a formal identity that's not just like whatever the architect felt like doing that day. It's like more of a considered, less arbitrary sort of a thing. So that I think is another thing I've felt drawn to. Frank Furness from Philadelphia, turn of the century or earlier. I love the clashing of scale in these buildings. I remember being taught in school, like, the word violent, like Frank Furness's violent fusing of inconsistent forms and somehow inappropriate. That sort of speaks to something I think is worth exploring. And believe it or not, Julian Schnabel's building downtown, I love. I think this is one of the weirdest. I mean, people hate this thing. I mean, it is just considered the most god-awful nightmare. His fake villa, pink. But I'm so happy that thing exists because it's such an affront to the Richard Myers shit around the corner. And it's all, whatever. I'm glad it's all coexisting. But, they need more of this, We need more, even though Julian's not the kind of guy everyone gets behind so easily. A few more drawings, I guess. Here you see, my attempt at trying to integrate the idea of the architectural, the logic of it, the graphicness, the structuralism with the invasion, maybe. I guess these are kind of invasionistic drawings I did about almost 10 years ago. They led into, this is a painting of my last 2010 show with David Nolan, which wasn't a great, well, I liked some of them, but nobody else really did. But this group, and this is the most successful one probably by far, pretty large. But for what it's worth, to me, this was like, how do you do a large-scale painting and not, like keep it looser, make it more about marks. I guess I felt like I was getting a little more confident about using mark making as the general vehicle for the exploration. It's still, I called it a cephaloglyph, glyph, like cephalopod, glyphic kind of a thing happening here. This was one I actually really liked from that group. a little more worked on, a little more, dense. These are some drawings from that era. This is a sequence of small ones I'm just showing because a friend of mine who has a great gallery in Great Barrington, Jeffrey Young, poet, has a kind of a cool little gallery. See, I've shown things with him. He put out this notion of doing a bunch of drawings based on the Beatles, which I don't know what the hell that had to do with anything, but I started doing structural drawings, and then words came into the picture. So for me, that was important. Like, well, this one, it says brown chrome, but it doesn't matter that you can't read it, but that's what the title is, brown chrome. But this one was an important one, You Must Relax, which ultimately got its stimulus from, I think, one way or another by listening to Alan Watts, the great Zen sort of lecturer, late Alan Watts, who I listened to a lot of his, I don't know if you guys have ever heard him talk, it's completely amazing, I think. And he had a lecture of some sort that he trafficked in some notions of how the impossibility or inappropriateness of demanding things from people, from yourself, or from others that are actually only have any worth if they're involuntary. So there's a kind of circular contradiction in that observation that you can't demand love or something. It's like force someone to love you. And the idea of like forcing yourself to relax to me seemed like a kind of a equal. Anyway, I think it's good advice. Frankly, I know for me it's necessary. So these became like a cool series to do. Is another You Must Relax, admittedly neurotically drawn, but that's the idea. But this was a good sequence of like almost borderline self-help drawings, or sort of like desire, like money. Like I drew money, and I'm going to go on record saying that it actually worked. Like if you write down the stuff you want, you start getting it, kind of, like a little bit here and there. It actually happens. You can invoke these things. So I have to say, these money drawings were actually kind of funny. I mean, rare moment of my directness, but it was kind of a cool exercise to do, and they had a certain snappiness about them. Oh, this one was important too. We blew it, which is a line from the movie Easy Rider, which I spent a lot of time thinking about as a personal connection in my own, once again, with like the Led Zeppelin thing as a kid, a sort of mythologizing of some kind of cultural signifier that I felt was ultimately is symptomatic for me of being a certain age at a certain time, 70s growing up, feeling ripped off that I missed all the really cool shit, the counterculture. So it's like I seem to have this ongoing wrestledness with countercultureness and 60s-ness that, I have to put in some perspective. I don't think I've fallen victim to a nostalgia for it, per se, or I don't think the work has, I hope, but these are some crusty small paintings I did in recent years. But I think that, once again, getting back to that like Cezanne, Led Zeppelin thing, there's this ongoing weighing back and forth spectrum. These are collages I did. I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. These really like crusty stuff accumulates in the studio, and you're like, what? I had all these frames laying around, and I just felt like I needed to glue it all together and see what can happen. And some interesting things emerged from that. This is like the studio, for example, at that time. Things laying around, you see how the dynamic can work sometimes. So this painting, this is the last show I did a year ago with Derek Eller, a painting called Catholic Deli, which I was pretty happy with this one. I mean, admittedly, it's kind of a cheesy title, but the yellow, Katz's Deli in New York, have you guys ever been there? It's like this really ugly yellow light in it, and the idea of this weird kind of religious-y imagery. That was the same painting in a different state. I mean, I figured I would show some of these paintings in different states, and admittedly run the risk of people going, oh man, why did you change it? But it's the way it goes sometimes. This one was in the other last show a year ago called The Bell Notes, obviously, related to Arthur Young. That was it. I mean, this was a great example of a painting that was in, 10 different states of finishedness. And hung around the studio forever, and then it, just got, I mean, it looks pretty good like that, really, I have to say. It's kind of annoying, I don't know. It looked good in the end, but I kind of like it. This one, iRobot, I titled this. This is another one of these paintings that had horrendous levels of encrustation on it. I mean, not horrendous, it's the painting, but it was like, for me, kind of a shocking amount of data, and it just wouldn't die. The painting, it would not, and it was so wrong for so long. And, I really have to admit, it kind of surprised me how the damn thing turned out as a good painting, and even more weird was the way people wrote about and remarked about that last show, especially a painting like this, which this is it in another state, that, all these aspects of these surfaces in the past to me were like complete, like death sentences, death knells of like, no one's, it's ugly, why do you have to put all that shit? Suddenly they start writing and saying things like, the amazingly built-up surfaces signify incredible authority. I'm like, well, how did that happen? Like, is it really that much better? I guess, I don't know. So you never know. Anything is possible. I always say too, like, I really never throw paintings out because I'm either, both cheap and Catholic in a weird way. So there's like a redemption is always possible. There's always redemption is always right around the corner. Here's a little one I did, and it was in the show. This was another really cool. This took like a day. I mean, that's like so rare that something came out good. This one I call Potato Battery, which I really like. That one. That's a small painting. This is a larger one that also was like a nightmare for years. Since 2010. So it started in 2010. I finished it last year. Called Seven Grain Satan. And that was like 8 or so feet big, and another little ritualistic looking small painting. Another one I titled We Blew It, the Easy Rider. This one's called Get the Cannolis, Godfather type reference. So, this idea of titling from movies and things like that are fun to do. And so these are completely improvisational paintings too. I mean, they really were just like start, see what happens, play around, investigate. This one I did want to read, actually. A fellow wrote a review in the Paris Review, and he used this painting for what it's called Reverse Epiphany. But this is, next time I do one of these, I'm going to have more quotes that I like from critics or whatever. But this guy wrote something I loved. And he wrote, the whole thing was great, but he says that at some point he says in here that, where the hell is it? That you can talk about, you find yourself much of the time you can talk about these paintings as you'd talk about something half buried in your backyard. They seem not just encrusted, but mulched in paint and grime. I love that. I'm sorry, it makes me very happy. Because it's like this, I don't want these to be like, I would rather they're seen as the result, or actually the word I really like is a condition. Like the painting should be a condition, not anything it can do to avoid its lineage, let's say, as painted in some official way. I mean, obviously, they're just paint. There's nothing crazy going on. But the idea of the way he's contextualizing it as almost like the result of some whole other process is very gratifying to me. So that I was happy about. And there have been some other good ones. This is like one of the biggest paintings ever, not in the world ever, I mean for me ever. 153 inches. This was it in an early state, like drawing. Once again, I think I'm just trying to get better at, being more drawing-ish with the paintings in early stages. And this is just some shots of the Aldrich installation I did. It was great. This was a great double-ceilinged room that was really fun to do. They let me put up all this weird ephemera stuff with all these images some of you guys might remember from this whole spew. So it was nice to sort of have this opportunity to just play around in the museum. There's a little painting from last summer, another painting from last summer that was in the show. Oh, this is some weird thing I'm working on. Why am I showing this? Okay. But this is a new one I'm pretty happy with. Small ones. Oh, some of these are in my, I have a current show up at the Half Gallery, and this one is in that show. This one is different. This is getting worked on. That's in the show, and this is just studio portraiture. And there you have it. Alrighty. Anybody, take your time if you want to ask any questions. Oh, we can put the music back on, like NPR does.
I'm curious about the current show at Half Gallery and the title, because I'm just having fun listening to your explanation.
Pre-linguistic granola.
Yeah, what's that about?
Thanks for mentioning that. Well, I mean, I think I take titles seriously, meaning that I'm constantly trying to find phrases or couplets or something-ish that have words that ideally sort of like have very purposeful meanings, but sort of cancel each other out in some weird way, but aren't obviously binary. And in all honesty, I don't know what it means. I mean, I like the idea of like a hippie reference. I like the idea of like something kind of ordinary, like 7 Grain Satan, you know.
Yeah.
Like the idea of sort of wedding something maybe a little sinister sounding with something supposedly wholesome and healthy, you know, something along those lines. And ideally it should sound sort of good. I was going to, I mean, to be honest with you, I was going to call the show Plastic Bag in a Tree at first. Just as, I don't know, I was desperate and I saw a plastic bag in a tree and I thought, oh, it's like a condition. It's like, how'd that get there? And then Bill, the guy with the gallery, was like, that's kind of sad. I was like, yeah, you're kind of right. He goes, I love I said, well, I got this other title, Pre-Linguistic Granola. That's awesome. I love that. And people seem to like it, so I don't know. But that's, you know, like another one I did with Jeff Young, a book we did called Gnostic Hernia. Something like that, you know, the idea of knowledge meets rupture. Makes sense to me, you know, it's all very logical. Any other inquiries of any sort? Yes?
I have one of those really terrible comment questions.
It's a comment, not a question?
I'll find out after I'm done saying it.
Okay, bring it.
Sometimes it seems like for work when you're doing an octopus, you really look like you're owning, or a helicopter, you really look like you're owning the imagery that you're playing with. And then sometimes when I was looking at the buildings, I feel like you're just remixing the building itself has more of an aura than like your work of it. But that's not always the case. I can't necessarily tell.
You mean it's more like illustrative or something? Yeah.
But
Well, that one painting, the sort of like goofier painting, I think, may have gotten closer
yeah,
to
actually.
the ownership. But I hear you, you're right. That's a good point.
And one thing I was curious about was I thought it was really an inspirational show, the one that you were talking about, and Julie and too, and getting all the other guys' names too. And it kind of feels like, in a weird way, I see some of you working at Amazing Kind of Face who make work that looks like they're copying you, or copying someone from that book. And I'm kind of curious about if you ever feel like you're ever trying to, like, in a weird way, own a kind of way of making a mark, or like, because when I'm thinking about the octopuses and helicopters, it really seems to like gel with the way that you know, have that horror back you want to fill out thing. But the architecture doesn't really, to me, like, sit the same way. It looks like you would illustrate. I was curious what you feel about the kind of concept of like owning a mark.
Well, I don't know anything about owning marks per se. I think like, you know, mark making, frankly, it's like, it's kind of wed to whatever purpose is going on in the painting, if that makes any sense. It's wed to that. I don't start off going, you know, really what happens, in all honesty, most of these friggin' paintings, I mean, it's really like, I get caught in a corner and I gotta escape. You know, it's like, I mean, there's a couple of occasions where these things go according to some kind of plan.
You know what else escapes? Helicopters and octopuses.
Oh, well, thank you very much, you say. Yes.
Buildings, yeah.
I heard that. Do you really hate those buildings?
I don't think they should as well. They don't have the same way that the
I mean, you're bringing up, tangentially, you're bringing up something about whether it's other people, painting, blah, blah, way. You're sort of bringing up the aspect of what do you do with a sense you get from the world about what you're doing. And I'm sort of like, I kind of have this feeling like people, for what it's worth, I don't really give a damn, are like, oh, are you really another Octopus helicopter thing? And I'm like, dude, I haven't even started with this. I feel like this is like, I am just, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's maybe a problem. You know, I have to really figure out. I don't think I've owned it graphically, maybe. Maybe you're right, it's got an ownership in terms of fabrication. But I don't feel like I've really figured out their role or not role, but ultimately what's going on. I think there's many more layers. I think I could personalize it more, to be honest with you. And yeah, the building thing, that's a pretty good observation. Yeah, I don't feel like, it's like, well, I'm witnessing those things though. You know, buildings to me are clinical. And of course it's interesting, on some level, I didn't plan it, but the architecture I did in the beginning, you're not talking about the cathedral things, are you? The more like Baroque,
No,
wiggly ones?
they're like kind of in the center of the painting.
Yeah.
They really just sit.
Well, that's like, those were exercises in me, I think, trying to, maybe, you're right in a weird way, maybe ingenuously, fakely, just doing things that I see other artists do and get away with. Like, oh, why do I have to make everything so chaotic and wiggly all the time? Why can't I just plop something right in the middle and be all like clinical about it and not so invested? And maybe you're right. Maybe it's you're just not meant to. I'm not meant to do that. That's good.
I saw the Sudi Albany show that had some of those buildings in it.
Oh yeah.
And maybe you can't see like in the images up here, but in some of those, there's like lots of little window panes. And each one has all sorts of wiggly shit going on.
Correct.
There's
Some.
a lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff happening in the paintings that you can't really see.
In some, that was that exact idea, like all the little like pixels or something of those glass. I mean, I am really kind of obsessed with the abstractions that go on in those little windows. Thanks for bringing that up. But I don't feel like I've really, frankly, fully realized that either. I mean, it comes up in some of those paintings. I don't know which one. You're talking about one of the ones I showed?
Yeah, I mean, you showed a lot of the ones that were in the Albany show. A lot of the building ones were in the Albany show. And I really like that one where the building was plopped right in the center,
Yeah.
but it had that kind of melting green thing,
Oh, exactly.
kind of going
Yeah.
all around it. And I don't remember if there is an octopus or a helicopter in that picture, but
No, it's just,
I like
I
that
really
painting a lot.
cheese balled out.
I think the green of the
Oh, thanks.
with all this stuff happening in the windows.
That's true. That one has it. That one does have it. That's stuff. That's what you're looking for. Legally reflective stuff. But I mean, to be honest, a lot of the new paintings, like the stuff in this Granola show, are really a relief in a way, because none of them have any overt. Not a relief. I mean, it's just a different trajectory. Sometimes I think you have to leave yourself open. I do anyway. Of like, look, I just want to make a dumb, weird, idiotic abstraction or something. Just something procedural. Something emerges as it's aimless. The activity is aimless, and these things accumulate. There's like 400 paintings sitting around. You're like, what the hell am I doing here? And little by little, you just attack them, or you thrive them, and you find out ways of stimulating what's going on in those things.
It's kind of like that first crumpled aluminum foil ball that you showed.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking about that now with those buildings and the window and the reflections.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. Unlike most professional types, more professional types, they wouldn't go into that crap until they had it all figured out. You see, I didn't learn that lesson in lecture school. I didn't quite pick that one up. But more interesting to throw stuff out. I can see where the chips live.
I want to talk about, have you talk about more about influences. I see a lot of sort of late surrealist, early Avex, Mata, and Parliament, and those guys. I'm wondering if you looked at those
why that might be in there. I think I do like. I guess I'm even currently doing things that really do echo like pre-drip Pollock type things. If that's what you're
Yeah.
referring
And
to.
also, early rock.
Early Rothko.
Yeah. It's sort of biomorphic, but I really like the structural work too. It works nice with the rhythm, and then brutalist as well. In that, right? Brutalist. I mean, the architecture, some of the architecture you're showing is really sort of jiving with not necessarily like new buffet art group, but brutalist architecture.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, there have been moments when, and I've thought about this any number of ways, like people will remark like, it's almost like some of these are outsider-ish and some of these border on outside, and anytime, that feels like a huge victory, if you can be, or at least me anyway, it's like if I can get out of this headspace and go somewhere purposeful in a way that leaves the realm of all the other, stuff I'm doing now. Talking that seems like a weird. But then you have to, you have to be totally honest. I mean, I'm not some would argue, but I'm not completely dysfunctional human being. I have some aptitude for functioning. But I was thinking recently, and it was nagging me about this. What's the difference ultimately between surrealism, like say Ernst and whoever, and outsider? Like it seems like certain great outsider things like are wildly, they just have better legs. They just look timeless. And I was thinking one of the reasons, arguably, what you get out of great outs like Adolf Wolfley or obviously Darger and so many of those guys, or Ramirez, and there's tons, great ones, Hal Hawkins, is there's an agenda those guys are painting, and this is where I feel really kind of like, whoa, I gotta get my shit together, because it's surrealists did things aesthetically, for aesthetic reasons, really. Surrealism is about, a certain degree of incredible, I mean, they're brilliant, Ali is obviously, going somewhere heavy, and Ernst is great, but they're procedural, and they're very committed to investigating what things can look like in a really stimulated way. But they're not as ruthless and as completely, in some cases, of course, tragically, wed to a type of mental agenda that you see in certain outsiderish, mentally unstable types who just can't help themselves. And that's like, sort of badass, when you sort of think about that. But then, you can't be phony, you can't, but we're all potential outsiders. I mean, everybody's got an inner outsider, right? I'm sure other people have said that. I'm not claiming I made that up. But I'm happy that I finally solved what I think is the difference between surrealism and, let's say, outsider art. I don't know what the appropriate term nowadays is. It's self-taught or keeps going all over the place. But that's also like in the movie, in Close Encounters. He's, for what it's worth, he's taken over by some compulsion. And I like, that seems like a useful metaphor.
Can I comment?
Okay.
I thought you were hilarious, and I loved your talk just from that.
Oh, gee.
Even forget about the art. I just
Oh,
thought
good.
your delivery was fantastic.
So what's wrong with the paintings?
No. I think it was covered.
Oh, thanks.
You did a great, entertaining.
Oh,
talk.
well,
Yeah.
should be somewhat.
So the pressure's on now.
No, the pressure is off. Are you kidding me?
I mean, you're here until Thursday, you gotta go.
Yeah. Well, where am I going to go? There's an electric fence around this place.
Our own reality.
No, I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys are doing. I'm really anxious to come up and see. It's nice to. But yeah, this was all I was worried about. I'd much rather talk about other people's work.
Well, we look forward to it, so thanks, Steve.
Sure, thank you.